Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Every day, it seems, the President of the United States sounds more and more like an authoritarian strongman from a country we no longer recognize as our own. Today's latest demonstration came, as it so often does, in a tweet, quote, "We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. Our system is a mockery to good immigration policy and law and order." Now, you could write off Donald Trump's constant tweet storming as nothing more than sound and fury, if not for what's actually happening this very moment in our country. The 2,300 immigrant children taken from their families, some of them toddlers, even babies. The building of tent cities on military bases, camps to hold children, inside which, we might add, we only have government-provided images because media are not allowed to independently record what goes on inside there. The turning away of asylum seekers, well documented by now, at ports of entry against our own laws. And now, according to the Texas Tribune, our government effectively holding many of these immigrant children we've taken from their parents, children our government ripped away from them, holding them as hostages to then force people to give up their legal asylum claims and agree to be deported. This is the backdrop for the president's explicit call to deport people at will without any recourse to a legal system or any acknowledgement of the rule of law. But for anyone tempted to shrug off the president's tweet this morning, he revisited the topic later in the day.
And we have to change our laws. We have to make them sensible. They came in to see me last week. They said, we'd like to hire 5,000 more judges. 5,000. You ever hear of a thing like that? Judges. Well, we're appointing 145 judges here, and everyone goes through this extreme vetting process. Talking about 5,000. Where do you find 5,000 people to be judges? And you know what it leads? It leads to graft. It leads to a lot of other things.
The president is a little confused about immigration judges who are very different than the appellate and district court judges he's appointing, but that's for another time. Now, it has been a through line of this president's rhetoric that he doesn't really even bother to pretend to care about the Constitution, makes no pretense of it. But we are currently getting a very bleak picture of what that worldview looks like when it is put into practice on vulnerable populations at the border. Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, visited a tent city for immigrant children in Tornillo, Texas last week. And maybe let me start by asking you, what does it look like up close when you saw it?
As you have been reporting so well for the last weeks, Chris, it is a heartbreaking, deepening humanitarian crisis. And again, the through line here is in every one of these policies, the president is using children as pawns and hostages. First, to try to pressure Congress into changing the law. He's now defying it. Then to persuade some of these asylum seekers to leave the country if they are reunited. There is no plan for reunification, and there is deepening chaos and confusion, even among the border agents, the Border Patrol agents, and the United States Customs and Border Protection agents who say, we need more judges. We need more resources to effectively and fairly enforce the law. So abandoning and abrogating due process has consequences not only financially, but also morally.
Let me ask you this. I mean, you're a United States Senator, and we have consistent reporting that CBP is turning people away at ports of entry when asking for asylum, that they've even in some cases moved their checkpoint to the median of the bridge so that no toe can touch American soil. That is a violation on its face of American law. What is Congress doing about that?
The Congress, very sadly and unconscionably, is doing nothing. And I believe, and I'm calling for it right now and in the next few days, that Congress must have hearings. We have an oversight responsibility. The Judiciary Committee, where I sit, should be having hearings this week to hold accountable the officials for turning away those asylum seekers at the ports of entry, in effect denying them the credible fair hearing that they're entitled to receive if they're in this country, and abrogating due process. Remember, due process is not only about fundamental fairness and the rule of law, it's also about making sure that determinations are accurate, because in many instances, if we unfairly and inaccurately deny asylum, we are, in effect, very likely condemning these people to death, torture, and other forms of violence.
Let's be clear, not just them. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. What the president is calling for is an extra-legal, unaccountable, and non-reviewable deportation force that can take people out of the country with no judicial review. Is there any reason to believe that such a thing, A, is constitutional, or B, would not result in American citizens being deported?
It will be challenged. It will be found illegal and unconstitutional when and if it's challenged. But more broadly and fundamentally, this country is heading for a train wreck at the border, because beyond those due process issues arising with respect to the asylum seekers at the ports of entry and the due process hearings, we're also threatening, I say we, the president is threatening to imprison tens of thousands of these individuals as he continues to prosecute them in camps that are very reminiscent of the internment facilities for the Japanese during World War II on military bases at tremendous financial cost. In fact, I visited a facility very much like the one that the president is contemplating. The cost per person there, $2,000 per day. Think of it, $2,000 per day.
Wait, $2,000 per day per person?
Per person at the Il Tornillo facility in El Paso. So we're talking about financial costs, but also moral and humanitarian costs.
All right, Senator Richard Blumenthal, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Attorney Natalia Cornelio is director of the Criminal Justice Reform Program at the Texas Civil Rights Project, and they've been representing a lot of the folks who have been detained by ICE and prosecuted. First, let's start with an update about what is happening on the ground, because there's lots of confusion. Let me start with this. Is separation still happening, or has that stopped to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, separation has stopped. As of Friday and Monday, we met no parents who had been separated from their children. So the last time we met with parents who had been separated from their children was last Thursday, the day after the executive order was signed.
So there's confusion a little bit between CBP, which is saying we're not recommending people for prosecution. DOJ wants to keep saying we're prosecuting everyone because they have this zero tolerance policy they adhere to. But what are you hearing about this idea that was reported in the Texas Tribune of parents essentially being offered, you can get your kid back if you sign this and agree to be deported immediately and waive your right to asylum? Have you heard that?
We have heard from the relative of one of our clients that he was told that he would be reunited with his child if he signed a voluntary departure. We also heard from the majority of the people that we interviewed that they would do anything to be reunited with their child. And so the concern is, regardless of whether they're told explicitly by CBP that choice or not, any decision that they would have to make regarding their immigration situation under the circumstances of not having their child with them by force is concerning. It's a coerced decision, essentially. So we're concerned about that.
Is there progress being made in notifying clients of yours about where their children are and how they can go about reunifying with them?
The process is very slow. It's essentially in Department of Homeland Security's hands. Of course, this all could have been avoided if parents had never been separated from their children. What we are doing now is scrambling as quickly as possible, essentially racing the clock to try to assure that parents are reunified with their children before something as serious as a deportation, separate from one another. And we do know of at least one case where the children were deported while the parents remained in custody in the United States.
The children were deported.
That's a concern.
Because I want to be, this is important. We have tracked numerous cases of parents being deported while children remain in custody. You're saying the opposite, children being sent back without their parents into a country they have fled because of danger.
That's right. In at least one case, that's right.
What does it say to you, or what do you hear when you hear the President of the United States, while building, going ahead with plans to build camps on military bases, keeping these children away from their parents, say it's ridiculous, all this judges, all this law talk, we need to grab people and deport them? What do you say to that?
I think that this problem of parents being separated from these children, this humanitarian human rights crisis, if there were due process, if people were entitled to attorneys and were able to see judges, this would have never happened. So I actually think that this traumatic experience that America just went through could have been avoided if the opposite of what the president is saying had happened. So it's not only a violation of international human rights law and our laws, but what just happened is proof of what could continue to happen if no due process is provided.
Explain that. What do you mean?
The lack of due process, the lack of access to courts or hearing officers, the lack of access to attorneys is what allows the government to have a non-transparent system, making a sweeping administrative decision to separate parents from their children. And it's only until, civil rights lawyers find out about it and scramble to try to talk to the parents that the information starts being tracked by anybody but the government. And so this type of behavior of a sweeping policy that's really concerning on a human rights level could happen if there's no due process, if there's no access to courts or hearings or attorneys. Those things protect human rights violations, civil rights violations, law violations from happening. So those are an important check on that. And I think that everyone should agree that there's got to be space to agree that civil rights and human rights have to be included in any dialogue about policy.
We should note the only reason we know about this isn't because of the government. It's because of lawyers who are in courtrooms suing over it and telling and talking to reporters about it. They were the point of contact while this policy was happening behind closed doors in a black box and children were being ripped from their parents. So Natalia Cornelio, thank you for what you're doing.
That's
Appreciate
exactly
it.
Right.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.